So let's talk about the HACCP and food safety. So everywhere that serves food needs to utilize or prepares food or boxes food needs to utilize this system. This is an acronym for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And essentially, it's just a scientific, rational system that identifies and assesses so that you can control hazards before they happen so that you don't make people sick. And this is used in all processing facilities. So originally it actually was created for NASA. So if you think about the fact that when you are dealing with food and food safety in a situation in which someone could not get medical attention and their health is kind of in a delicate balance anyway, this was a reactive instead of a preventative. And now it's really looked at more as a prevention of hazards. So originally it was, what do we do if we have an outbreak? And now it's, how do we prevent that outbreak? So essentially we just want to prevent the hazards before they cause an issue. So we want to reduce risks so that they will not occur at any point in the food process. This also is beneficial to a restaurant because if you have an outbreak, you can identify how it happened and where it happened, and that's really important. You can also utilize the data as a backup that if somebody says they had an outbreak or they said that they got sick from your facility, you have data to back up how you've handled all of your food items and potentially could help you in a legal stance. So we've talked about the three types of contamination: physical, biological, and chemical. And all of these items can cause illness, they can cause physical damage to a human body, and we have to make sure that we are only serving food that will not have any of these contaminants in them. We've also covered fat tom. So if you control bacterial growth in all of the steps of food preparation, then you will not have an outbreak or an illness. So the very first thing you want to do is you want to do a hazard analysis. So you look at the three types of hazards and you take your recipe. So you take your food item and your recipe and you look at all of the steps in that food preparation process. You look at all the steps in the flow of food. So you want to look at all of the steps in the flow of food and you want to assess where and how could this item become contaminated. So how could this item become contaminated biologically, chemically, or physically? So the second thing, you decide on these critical control points in the flow of food. So these are the points when you get the food and when you handle the food from raw until it gets to the consumer, at which the potential for the hazard can be controlled or eliminated. So the example of the flow of food here, this is a better representation. So when you have food, it flows into the restaurant. Receiving is the very first step. You want to make sure before you allow it and sign off from the people that you're receiving the food from, that you are receiving it from an established place of buying food. So you want to, you're not buying food from a suspicious. You want to make sure that when you receive it, that it is at temperature. Open your boxes. Make sure everything inside, you don't have moldy things or rotten things, that you're not receiving meat that is out of the time and temperature range. It goes directly into the storage. When you store it, that you are FIFOing, that you're making sure that you are first in, first out. So everything needs to be labeled. So immediately going into storage, things need to be dated. They need to be labeled. From storage, then move into food preparation areas. So making sure that these preparation areas are sanitized, that you are following proper sanitation procedures before you prepare the food, as you prepare the food, and then after. And then you move into the cooking. If the food is going to be cooked, remember there are ready to eat food items that are prepared that are not cooked, like salad or cold vegetables or dressings. Cooked food moves into the cooking range. And so making sure that you are following that time and temperature again, holding and displaying, cooling, reheating, and then serving. So as you can see, there are a lot of steps in the flow of food before it actually hits your table and before your guests are actually consuming it. So you really want to think about each one of these places and how are you going to prevent the three type of contaminants from getting into that food so that by the time you reach the serving that you are safely serving that food item. So the next step in the HACCP is establishing these target levels and critical limits. So an example would be if you have soup on your menu. What's the minimum time required to cook this item to kill the microorganisms? What's your maximum temperature to store the finished product? So we don't want to store the finished product in the refrigerator at boiling temperatures. That is unsafe for that food product. If you put hot things into a refrigerator, that heat has to go somewhere. And now your refrigerator is no longer the cold place that it's supposed to be. In addition to the fact that a lot of hot products with a tight lid on it can continue to grow bacteria, they don't cool fast enough. So making sure that you know, what's your protocol? What's your procedure for that? How are you going to monitor it? So the next way that you control these hazards is, so each of these CCPs, which is the flow of food. So in each steps of the flow of food, how are we going to check it? Who is going to check it? Establish a very clear routine and delegate these duties. You can't just assume, oh, somebody's going to get to it. When and how often is this going to be checked? Recommended every 2 hours. That may not always be possible in the top part of the restaurant service, such as the lunch rush or the dinner rush. But how many hours is it going to be before these items are checked? And then the next step is what's your corrective action plan? So when you go to check the soup that's out there on your buffet and you find that your soup is 160 degrees, maybe that's what you established as your minimal temperature. What's your corrective action plan? Are you going to take that soup back to the kitchen and reheat it for a period of time and then put it back on the buffet? Is it time to dispose of that food item? And so what's the procedures for that? And then the next step is, how do you verify that your system is working? So making sure that you test your time and temperature recording devices. Make sure that your thermometers are calibrated, your scales are calibrated. These are important. That your freezer and refrigerator, that these things all have thermometers in them. Your ovens, they need to have thermometers in there to make sure everything's calibrated. And then you want to make sure you document. So document and keep records of all of these things. You can't just have Joe Bob checked all of the soup on the buffet at 2:00 and take his word of mouth and just go ask him. You have to make sure you document and keep a record of actually keeping track of these critical control points and that you have a system in place. And make sure that the people that do it actually initial it so that you know who and when checked that. Some places use barcoding as part of record keeping. A lot of places it is digital, and so you just kind of scan something in. Even thermometers and stuff, a lot of them are just infrared, and so you just point and click, and it can kind of even like just download some data, which is really cool. So this is becoming an easier process. Labeling is so important in this system as well. So as a quick review, you assess the hazards, look at your recipes, your employee process, your temperatures, your customers, your suppliers, the size of your operation and your employees. You look at the flow of food every step along the way. You identify the critical control points. How do we prevent contamination? How do we prevent contaminants from surviving? How do we prevent growth of the contaminants? How do we set up the procedures? How are we going to measure this? What is the protocol for that? Who and how often is going to check this? What do we do when we find that a food item is not within the measurable system that we put into place? How do we verify the system works? Who's actually checking this? Is it the manager's job to do it? Is it the manager's job to check out the employees that are doing it? And what's your record keeping and documentation? So making sure that you follow these procedures will keep your restaurant safe, it'll keep your food items safe, and it'll prevent you from serving nasty or contaminated food.